Okay, we are just going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask you to please keep your microphones and your cameras off today, if you do not mind, for our event. So I am very happy to be introducing today Dr. Emily Channell-Justice, who is the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukrainian Program at Harvard University. So Dr. Channell-Justice is a social cultural anthropologist who's been doing research on Ukraine for over a decade now. So she does a lot of different work. She was able to do interviews during the Euromaidon protests back in 2014, and has a couple of new and forthcoming books. For one, she produced an edited volume called Decolonizing Queer Experiences in Eastern Europe and Eurasia that is now out, and has a forthcoming manuscript called Without the State, Self-Organization and Political Activism in Ukraine that should be forthcoming shortly. So today, Dr. Emily Channell-Justice will be speaking with us on the topic of a new world order, how Russia's war in Ukraine changes geopolitics. So I would like to thank the Department of International and Area Studies and the Romanoff Center for Russian Studies for co-sponsoring this event. Dr. Channell-Justice will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor for Q&A after that. I will be moderating the Q&A, so I ask that if you do have a question that you please put it in the chat, and then I will ask your question to Dr. Channell-Justice. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker today. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to everybody who's here, and thanks to the co-sponsors as well. I'm really, happy to see that so many people are still paying attention to Ukraine. I wish the news were different, but it isn't, and it's still really important that we think about what's happening there and we understand the big picture of what's going on. So that's kind of what I'll be focusing on today. Obviously, we're framing this discussion kind of the question of the new world order that's been being built or will have to be built kind of after this war is over. And so hopefully this will give you all a little bit of food for thought. So the war began, as you all know, February 24th, 2022. We are now in the 8th month of this war. According to the official estimates by the United Nations, 6,221 civilians have been killed thus far, including hundreds of children. And we can guess that the true number is probably a lot higher. There's 7.7 million refugees, most of whom have crossed Ukraine's western border to go to Europe, and 6.2 million people who are estimated to have been forced to leave their homes within the borders of Ukraine. The Ukrainian Armed Forces is currently claiming that 65,320 Russian soldiers have been killed so far in these past 8 months. Russia has also lost thousands of tanks and other vehicles, as well as airplanes, helicopters, drones, and boats. And most recently, over 200,000 Russians were mobilized to fight in the past month. So what are some of the questions we should be thinking about? When we're looking at this kind of thinking about the new world order that's being created, I came up with 5 questions. I think there are probably a lot more questions than this, but these are the ones that I'm thinking of. Obviously, NATO is a key player in the kind of geopolitical security order that we've been talking about. And this war has really forced us to think a little bit more about what the future of this organization is going to look like. And then relatedly, are there alternative security structures, something other than NATO, that we can imagine that might be more effective? And then the other questions revolve around, what do we do with a country like Russia in the world order that we're in? So Russia has shown us over the past 8 months, and honestly before that as well, that they don't respect a world built on national sovereignty. So what do we do with that? If our world order is built on this idea that countries have borders and they control what's in those borders, and Russia says, actually, we're going to claim that this belongs to us, how do we create an order where borders are respected? And does Russia get to continue to exist within that order? And then I think there's questions about the future, like bringing Russia to justice for its crimes. In particular, how do we hold Vladimir Putin and his supporters accountable? And now, how do we hold Russia's allies accountable? We've seen certainly over the past couple of weeks, evidence of Iranian-built drones that are being targeted that are targeting civilian infrastructure and civilian targets within Ukraine. So there are certainly other countries that are holding Russia, helping Russia out in this war. So these are my big picture questions. Again, if you have other questions, we can talk about them at the end as well. So I want to start by giving a little bit of history, looking at how we got to where we are, talking about how Ukrainian sovereignty is not a new conversation. So we know that in the beginning of the war, and actually a little bit before the war began, Vladimir Putin gave a couple of speeches in which he claimed that Ukraine was not actually a country, that Vladimir Lenin had created modern day Ukraine, a lot of kind of revisionist history explanations of Ukraine. And we know that Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire going back to the 17th century. Later, it was part of the Soviet Union. It was considered the second Soviet Republic because it had such an essential place within the Soviet Union structure. This is the map that I'm showing you right now is contemporary Ukraine. So this is what the borders of Ukraine looked like up until March of 2014. And during the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Bolshevik attempt to take over Ukraine successfully took over about half of the country of Ukraine, the kind of eastern part that you see divided by the Dnipro River in the middle. At the same time, there were several different groups of Ukrainian national activists who came together to establish what was called the Ukrainian People's Republic. And this was a sovereign country that existed from 1918 to 1922 that fought against the Bolsheviks to try to establish a Ukraine that could exist as a country with pretty much similar borders to what you see right now. Unfortunately, that structure did not continue to exist. It fell to Bolshevik encroachment. So the Bolsheviks took over Ukraine. By 1922, that eastern part of Ukraine, this part over here, was part of the Soviet Union. The western parts of the country and the southern parts of the country did not become part of the Soviet Union until much later on. The far western parts of the country didn't become part of the Soviet Union until 1945. And it's also important to note that there were Ukrainian national activist groups that were fighting against the Soviets throughout the 1940s and 1950s, pushing back against that. So it was never easy for the Soviets to take over Ukraine, let's put it that way. And then, of course, there were many Soviet policies. I'll just mention one. There were many Soviet policies that were designed to crush the Ukrainian national movement, to stifle any Ukrainian national identity, because there was already so much historical evidence that Ukrainians wanted to fight for their own country, and obviously that was unacceptable in the Soviet period. So one of the most important, if not the most important policies was the Soviet Union-wide famine that happened in 1932 and 1933. So this was a man-made famine that came out of Stalinist policies about agriculture. And in Ukraine, it affected countries outside of Ukraine, but in Ukraine in particular, it was designed to root out the intellectual classes. So we see also a lot of repression of artists, cultural actors, in addition to this countrywide famine, where some 4 million people starved to death in Ukraine. And actually, there are claims that the number is a lot higher because this famine, which is known as Holodomor in Ukrainian, because this famine was so covered up by the Soviet authorities, we actually don't have great records about how many people died as a cause of this famine. And keeping in mind that this is something that happened in the 1930s, this is not that long ago for a lot of Ukrainians. There's still people who were alive during this period, whose grandparents were alive during this period, whose parents were alive during this period. So this part of Ukrainian national identity and this threat to Ukrainian national identity, it's very important, and it continues to be significant to Ukrainians today. So like the rest of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became independent in 1991. Ukraine became independent via a referendum. In Ukraine, the only way to change Ukrainian territory is by national referendum. So what this map shows us is the 1991 referendum votes. Overall, 92.3% of Ukrainians approved the Ukraine's independence referendum. Obviously, you can see on this map that the Ukrainian independence referendum was much more popular, well, maybe not much, but more popular in Western Ukraine. You can see very high percentages of support for independence. But I think it's really important that we recognize that in the two territories furthest to the east, this is Donetsk and Luhansk regions. These are the regions that we'll be talking about again and again today. That's still a very large majority. 83% of people wanted Ukraine to be independent from the Soviet Union in 1993. So a lot of the narratives that we've been hearing about Ukraine is that there's a division between East and West, that people don't have the same ideals or mentality. And I think this map is really indicative that at least in 1991, when Ukraine became independent, which is what this war is about, people actually did in fact want Ukraine to be an independent country. And then all the way in the South, Crimea also voted in favor of the independence referendum. 54% is not as big of a majority, but it is still a majority. So the whole country of Ukraine supports Ukrainian independence in 1991. And at the time, as we know, Russia also becomes an independent country and accepts Ukrainian independence at this time. So what was Ukraine doing over the past 30 years up until this war started? The thing that I think that makes Ukraine the most different from its neighbors is that Ukraine has been working to build a democracy since 1991. And I'll be the first to say that this democracy is not perfect. There have been many problems with it. And there's been lots of pushback and negotiation on what that democracy should look like. But the fact of the matter is, Ukraine has had six presidents. Sorry, the first one's not even on this map. 6 presidents since its independence, 5 since 2000. And as you can see from this slide, its neighbors, notably Russia, Belarus, have had basically the same president throughout that whole time period, except for that one moment in time when Russia briefly had Dmitry Medvedev as president, Putin was the prime minister. And so we know that he still had a very significant influence in Russian politics at that point. But I think that, obviously these transfers of power, these shifts from one president to another in Ukraine, they've been contentious. I'll talk about them a little more on the next slide. But Ukraine has been working toward a democracy for a long time, and especially in the last 2 presidents, 2014, obviously you recognize Volodymyr Zielinski, who was elected in 2019. There was a really significant continuation of a lot of policies that had been working very well. Zielinski was elected by a very popular vote. And I really think that there was a belief that Ukraine's democracy could be improved. But I also think that that successful democracy is precisely what threatens Vladimir Putin and Russia, because if Russians start to see that Ukrainians have democracy actually improves their quality of life, they have more opportunities, they have a stronger economy, they're better integrated into the world order, that actually changes how Russians see their own president, who of course is not elected legitimately, who has been telling them for many years, we have to do things a different way. That's going to be better for us in the long run. Ukraine has been showing them evidence that that's actually not the case. Of course, as I mentioned, Ukrainian transfer of power from one president to another has not always been totally peaceful. In 2013 and 2014, the protests known as Euromaidon took place. So these protests were in response to the president at that time, Viktor Yanukovych, who wanted to turn Ukraine back to Russia. He wanted to enter an economic agreement with Russia instead of bringing Ukraine on the path to Europe. People came out in the streets. They decided they wanted to fight for that European future. This is a photo that I took during those protests. That was one of the kind of prime moments of my research. But I really, these protests are significant, not just because they're about Ukraine's European future, but they're also this place where people decide that they want to be committed to Ukrainian democracy. They feel like together they can build something better. So we also see, not only do we see this rebuilding of democratic institutions, but we also see the strengthening of activist institutions and what we like to call civil society, where people who are not officially part of the government also have a very strong political voice, an effective political voice. They can make changes. They hold their politicians accountable. So this moment is really when we start to see that people in Ukraine come together for this bigger belief. And this is also the thing that initially triggers the Russian invasion into Ukraine. So going back to my previous point, where what Vladimir Putin really fears the most is successful democracy in Ukraine, these protests are showing that what people want is a democratic future. So Vladimir Putin's response is to invade part of the country. So in March of 2014, after these protests have ended, the pro-Russian president has been ousted. This is when these little green men, was what they were called. They were a group of Russian soldiers who entered into the Crimean Peninsula at the bottom of the screen, very swiftly took it over, said this is part of Russia. There was very minimal response from the Western world. The Russian forces held what they called a referendum in 2014, is absolutely not recognized as legitimate by the majority of actors in the world. As I already mentioned in the slide about the independence movement, a referendum in Ukraine is only valid if the entire country is allowed to vote on it. So a referendum about Crimea that only takes place in Crimea is not in fact a valid referendum at all. Additionally, there was lots of evidence that there was repression of certain voters, so the exclusion of Crimean Tatars, for example, as well as Ukrainian speakers, and there was certainly ballot rigging and lots of other types of technologies that have often been used in Russian elections were also in evidence in Crimea as well. So that happens in March of 2014. Crimean Peninsula is taken over. And then we start to see later in 2014, separatist groups who are starting to make similar claims in the eastern regions that you can see on the eastern side of your screen in red here. So first we start out with separatist activists who are claiming that they also want to be part of Russia. And ultimately these groups are supported by Russian soldiers, they're supported by Russian arms. These borders are totally changed around. The Ukrainian military also responds. They're fighting back to take over this territory. Unfortunately, that war continued for the next 8 years. There were a couple of ceasefires that were agreed to, but they didn't actually stop the fighting completely. That was, there was always back and forth. The border that you see there, the front line was always contentious. But ultimately, there was a kind of contained portion where the red part is the part that was occupied by these separatists and these Russian forces. The gray part is the rest of those regions that was controlled by the Ukrainian military. And then obviously they border right on Russia. There were a lot of what I would say pretty malicious policies that Russia has been putting forward in the past 8 years, most notably giving out Russian passports in those territories. Those passports did not include full citizenship for the occupants of those territories, but basically they allowed them to vote in certain elections in Russia, get jobs in certain parts of Russia. And that border between these two territories in Russia was very porous and very open. And actually the border between these territories in Ukraine was as well. It was shut down during the COVID pandemic, and the authorities in the occupied territories actually refused to open those borders back up. That happened earlier in 2021. So that, again, I think was another kind of precursor that's very important in understanding what has happened since then. And the final really essential thing to remember about Ukraine in 2014 is that Ukraine was a neutral country. So we have heard so much about NATO and NATO expansion and Vladimir Putin claiming that he's only responding to NATO expansion. And if Ukraine had no interest in joining NATO, and if NATO had no interest in expanding, then they would not need to invade Ukraine. They invaded Ukraine in 2014 when Ukraine was neutral, when Ukraine had no likelihood of joining NATO. And as you can see on the chart on the right, very little interest among Ukrainians in joining NATO. It really was not on the table. Obviously, I need to update the map that's showing you NATO expansion to include Finland and Sweden, which of course have decided that they would now like to join NATO as well. So what I think is most interesting here is that Ukraine, really was focused on joining the European Union. So after those protests, the Euromaidan protests, Ukraine was really thinking about its future in Europe, whereas over the past really 3 or 4 years, is you can see in 2019 on the graph on my right, that's when we start to see an increase in interest in joining NATO. And that's very interesting because that actually coincides with the election of President Zielinski. And so this is data that's done by a group of researchers who do these surveys regularly over the course of, as you can see, many years, and they've continued as well, even during wartime, doing these surveys. But I think it's really, it's really significant. The timing is really significant because Ukrainians don't seem that interested in joining NATO until Russian threats start to ramp up, right? Until it becomes obvious that Ukraine might need the protection of NATO, and the only country they need protection from is Russia. So, at the same time that Russia is claiming NATO expansion is a broach of the agreement of the world order, Ukraine is also having its territory threatened. And the other thing that's important to remember is that in 1994, well, previous to independence, Ukraine hosted the majority of the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal. And in 1994, Ukraine decided to give up those nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, they went back to Russia. But the idea was that as part of rebuilding this post-Soviet world order, Ukraine would give up those nuclear weapons because denuclearization was a very key part of the world building that post-Soviet world order. In exchange, Russia, the US, and the United Kingdom would guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty. So this was known as the Budapest Memorandum. And this is a document that, of course, is absolutely essential to understand in this context, because Ukraine's sovereignty has in fact been violated. So the question for Ukraine is, who is going to protect us? We gave up our nuclear weapons, which theoretically would have deterred Russia from invading our country. And the countries that convinced us to give up those weapons now, according to Ukraine, have an obligation to protect Ukraine, from Russia. The document called a security guarantee is not the same thing as a treaty. It has no actual obligation involved. So there is really no specific recourse that Ukraine can force anybody to help them out. A lot of people, including the people who negotiated that agreement, have expressed substantial regret for having encouraged Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. Although at the time, the politicians doing that were so invested in making sure Ukraine was included in the world order, in talking about European security, they really had no other option. So it's kind of it was really a lose-lose situation for Ukraine, unfortunately. But this is also the time in 1994 when NATO countries sort of agree that NATO won't expand any further. So we get, it is correct to say that NATO did promise not to expand, but it was also correct to say that Russia agreed not to violate Ukraine's sovereignty. So both of those things have happened. Obviously, that doesn't make anybody in the right. And obviously the reason that countries want to continue to join NATO is because the security threat of Russia is a substantial one. And as we already know also, Ukraine is not the first country that Russia has invaded since 1991. They invaded Georgia, which you can also see in the yellow on the bottom of this map as well, in 2008. We can go back further to look at Russia's assaults on Chechnya in the 1990s. So there's a real reason that many of these countries have experienced and felt that threat coming from Russia in the first place. So, this is kind of I think, the big question. What's the future of NATO look like? To some extent, NATO has been rejuvenated because of this war. Finland and Sweden, which have been neutral since the foundation of NATO, have now realized that NATO's protection is essential to have. Obviously, Ukraine has also applied for membership. So all of these things, I think, to some extent, actually rejuvenate NATO as a security structure. So I think it's important to talk a little bit about what has been going on in Ukraine in the past 8 months. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to give a full summary of all of that time. But it's interesting. The timing of this particular talk is interesting. If we had talked 2 weeks ago, I would have given a totally different assessment. But of course, what we've seen the past 2 Mondays are pretty significant attacks on civilian targets across Ukraine, especially in Kyiv. But we've seen, I mentioned Iranian drones being used to target civilian infrastructure, which, by the way, is a violation of the Geneva Convention. It is, in fact, a war crime to attack civilian infrastructure. And really, the reason is because Russia has gone pretty much on record to say that they would like to target Ukraine's infrastructure, heating, energy, electrical stations, because they hope that Russia will be able to destroy those things in anticipation of winter. That will theoretically force Ukraine's hand, bring them back to the negotiating table, which of course people in Ukraine are not willing to do right now. These strikes, it's also, we've seen a lot of, I'm sure you saw in the news, the attack on the Kerch Bridge. I put that next to the Crimean Peninsula so you can kind of see where that bridge is. That bridge is a very significant military target because those supply chains, you can see the fire on the top is a train. Those train supply lines were supporting the Russian military in southern Ukraine in the red part. So that was a very legitimate military target. It's really important to know that the civilian targeting in Kiev is not a response to the attack on that bridge based on how systematic those strikes were. They would have had to have been planned far in advance to position all the weapons and all of that sort of thing. It's also, as you know, the Ukrainian military has been making pretty significant gains. So this map, I think this is War Mapper. I put his handle up on the top, and you can get a new map every day. So what we have is the dark purple here are the two parts of Ukraine that had been occupied up until the war began. The red parts are the parts that have been occupied since February 24th. So most of southern and eastern Ukraine. And then the lighter pink in the middle is where Ukrainian forces have made territorial gains, in particularly over the past couple of months. So, that pushback from Ukrainian forces has been really essential in turning the tide of the war as well. Russia is not going to succeed at taking over the majority of the country. And I'm sure that many of you have also seen a lot of the news about, what they've uncovered. Lots of civilian casualties, mass graves, torture chambers, filtration camps, all kinds of really horrifying things that, again, there's lots of evidence of war crimes. There's lots of evidence gathering about the war crimes in anticipation of some sort of future justice that will hopefully be brought. But these are really, really difficult. And we're obviously assuming that Ukrainian forces, as they continue to liberate these territories, will continue to find such things as well. There's obviously also a significant kind of humanitarian component. We don't always think about the humanitarian component as part of a kind of geopolitical question, but the mass movement of people out of Ukraine since the war began, I think, really changes the shape of European security in particular. So this map comes from the UN High Commission on Refugees, and the numbers, I updated the numbers I gave a talk that featured this map with the numbers in June, and the difference is remarkable. So I mentioned earlier, there are 7.7 million refugees from Ukraine. So these are mostly people who have gone west out of Ukraine. When I used this map in June, the number of people who were in Poland from Ukraine was over 4 million people. And now it's close to 1.5 million people. So what we've seen since the war began, first we saw the massive movement of people, the largest movement of people in Europe since World War II. Then we saw a lot of people who stayed in Poland. Then we saw a lot of people start to return to Ukraine. But then we also saw a lot of people start to move further on. So for example, the US started giving more visas out, the UK started giving more visas out, people started to move to Germany. There's been more movement because people seem to understand that the war is not going to end quite soon. So they have to sort of accept that they won't be returning home anytime soon. Unfortunately, so that changes, that obviously changes people's calculations in terms of how close they want to stay to Ukraine. I put the numbers for Russian Federation, the number of people who have gone to Russia. I don't really understand where they've gotten this number. Certainly, it is true that many people in Ukraine went to Russia in response to the war beginning as refugees. They wanted to go, they elected to go, and they did go. However, what we have seen most recently is a lot of forcible deportation of people who lived in the occupied territories And most alarmingly, recently, we have seen thousands of Ukrainian children who are being what Russia is calling repatriated to different parts of Russia. So these children are basically being taken out of Ukraine. Some of them were kids who lived in orphanages. Some of them were orphaned by the war. They're being taken, all of them put on a plane, taken somewhere else, and then given to Russian families. And it's very difficult to keep track of these children. Russia is, of course, pitching this as saving Ukrainian children from harm, without recognizing that they're the ones who cause the harm. But these kind of, again, these numbers are very hard to assess because we really don't have exactly the data that we would really need to understand, how many children this is talking about, how many people in Russia elected to go there, how many were forcibly deported, right? We don't really have this information. So again, that's something that we'll have to understand how to assess those numbers going forward. And then it's also important to talk about the number of internally displaced people. So currently the UN's number is at 6.2 million internally displaced people. But this is actually really difficult to assess. So internal displacement basically means that a person was forced to move from their home, but they did not leave the country. So a refugee has crossed the international border. Internally displaced people remain in the country. And that's, 6.2 million is still a massive number of people. Obviously, the vast majority of those people are from Eastern Ukraine, where much of the fighting has continued. But one thing that we really don't know when we're talking about those numbers, how many people are displaced and how many people should we be counting as homeless? So many homes, so much infrastructure has been destroyed that we don't know how many of the people who are displaced can return home if they have a home left, if those homes are safe. We're still seeing remnants of mining, Russian soldiers leaving grenades in people's homes when they were leaving, that sort of thing. So it's not just about returning, is there a home to return to, but is that home safe to return to? And then additionally, we have seen large numbers of attacks on healthcare facilities, educational facilities. And so when people are deciding whether or not to return home, that's also a question. If they're going home with their children, are there schools and hospitals so that their kids can go home and be in school and have healthcare and have access to medicine if they need it? Because those things are being targeted by Russian weapons, it can continue to be dangerous, even in the places that haven't seen as much of a concentration of attacks as have places like Eastern and Southern Ukraine. Obviously, there's a huge discussion that I think kind of zooming back into the very big picture. There's obviously a very big question about nuclear war. What's going to provoke, if we want to call it that, Putin to use nuclear weapons of any kind, either on the large scale or what we call a tactical nuclear weapon, which would have a smaller target, but would still, of course, be completely devastating. This is a really big question, and that's been something that has kept a lot of Ukraine's allies they've been hesitating to support Ukraine fully because of this idea that Putin might respond with nuclear force, and then what would that result in? And I think in that case, it's very important to remember that the only person in Russia who can decide to use nuclear weapons is Vladimir Putin, and so it's up to only one man to decide if he's being provoked. That's not really a fair position, I guess, for Ukrainians to have to suffer from, in my view. At the same time, I do think it's also important to note that most recent opinion polls of Ukrainians have said in no uncertain terms that Ukrainians, over 80% of Ukrainians, do not want to negotiate with Russia. They don't want to make concessions. They don't want to allow Russia to keep the territories it's occupied. And so it's very important to remember that Ukraine is not, and based on his popularity and success so far, President Zielinski is not going to negotiate with Russia as long as it's unpopular in Ukraine to do so. I think he's been a very good representative in that sense. And of course, asking Russia to negotiate assumes that Russia is a fair negotiating partner, and they've shown previously that they're not at all fair. They make a lot of promises that they don't keep. Right now, we're seeing a push. Russia is pushing for Ukraine to negotiate. There's a lot of speculation that the reason for this is so that they can regroup and push back in another full-scale invasion next year. So there's a lot, obviously a lot of moving parts. Obviously it's very clear that we don't want nuclear war, but at the same time, we certainly can't blame Ukrainians for wanting to, live in safety and keep their country whole, especially when Putin's lies about Ukraine are what's motivating what he thinks is the right thing to do. So that's kind of where we are now. I think so as to not leave you too feeling too hopeless about everything, there is a lot that you can do from where you are in terms of understanding what's going on and making sure other people understand what's going on. Reading and sharing verified information is honestly, given Russia's propensity for disinformation, given how successful they are and effective they are at using information tools, sharing good information about Ukraine is actually one of the most helpful things you can do. I recommend the Kyiv Independent. I think it is the best source in English about Ukraine. It mostly features journalists who are in Ukraine. They only write in English. They're people who are on the front lines. They're people, they do profiles on political leaders. And I think they just really do a fantastic job. At the Ukrainian Research Institute's website, which I've listed here, curie.harvard.edu, we have extensive resources, other kinds of news sources, as well as expert opinions. We have lots of videos from talks that we have hosted by other experts on various topics as well. And we have, we feature different collections, kind of featuring what other people are doing, right? So people are working on preserving cultural heritage, people are working on, collecting evidence of war crimes. So we've kind of gathered everything together so you can see what everybody's working on to help Ukraine. You can always contact your representatives, and I recommend Razum for Ukraine's website. They have a ton of good information, but they also have information about advocacy. The US is doing a lot to support Ukraine, and this is really amazing and really helpful, but it's actually really important that our representatives know that their constituents want that to continue. So you can easily write letters to your representatives and say, thank you for supporting Ukraine. You can write them and say, thank you for supporting Ukraine. Can you do a little bit more? There's so much that you can do. And again, that's something that Razum has form letters. You don't even have to come up with it yourself. You can just hit send. And that's really, really useful to make sure that US support continues for Ukraine. And if you're somebody who's in a position to donate, I really recommend the World Central Kitchen. They are still active in Ukraine despite the continued attacks. And if you want to donate directly to Ukraine to support the military, Come Back Alive is the best organization that does that. I've given you a lot of information, so please feel free to ask any clarifying questions. But otherwise, I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. So for anybody, if you have a question, either a clarifying question or more of a discussion question for Dr. Channell-Justice, please go ahead and pop it into the chat. We've already got a couple asked, so we'll start you off with an easy one, which was, do you see any scenario where the war could have been prevented? Is there anything that you could have seen, like looking back now over the past 8 months, that could have prevented Russia's invasion back in February in the first place?
I'm not sure if that's an easy one, but it is a good one. No, I think, well, in really honestly, to really prevent, unfortunately, I think we'd have to go back to 2014. I think the response to the invasion and annexation of Crimea would have had to be much more substantial because that response was so muted. And I will say, so that's, the Obama administration did implement some sanctions at that point, mostly on Russian political leaders, economic leaders. But for the most part, it seemed to me that the whole situation was very misunderstood because of Russian information that said that Crimea is mostly Russian people, right? That there's just enough of a way to understand that people might want to be part of Russia, right? That it made it really difficult to understand that, in fact, that was not an acceptable way for anything to happen politically. And I think that's part of what, and this whole idea of not provoking Russia, right? That's what makes everybody say, like, we don't want to respond. Everybody sits back, no real condemnation of what's going on. If I were Vladimir Putin, I would spend the next 8 years figuring out how to do a larger scale invasion, because nobody stopped me the first time. What's going to make me convinced that they're going to stop me the second time? That's really what I think would have had to happen. I mean, I've heard President Zielinski, he gave a talk at Harvard a few weeks ago, which you can actually watch online if you're interested. And he talked a lot about prevention and preparation. He was asking for preventative sanctions in January, December of 2021, and January of 2022 to prevent Russia from invading. I don't know if I believe that those would have worked. The Russian narrative is that sanctions don't affect us, right? That we're going to succeed anyway. So it's really hard for me to say if those would have succeeded, but really I would go back to 2014.
Yeah, awesome. Well, one of the justifications, as you pointed out, that Putin has used repeatedly behind the invasion is NATO and NATO expansion. Ukraine just a couple of weeks ago applied finally to join NATO. But as you point out in your presentation, there's really no pathway, or there was no pathway for Ukraine forward. It doesn't meet all of the requirements for NATO membership. So given that, why do you see that Ukraine is now choosing to apply to NATO? What do you think is the reason behind this?
Yeah, I think, I will say, Ukraine doesn't meet all of NATO's specifications, but it does meet some. And Ukraine's military reforms, the Ukrainian military was in a very poor position in 2014 when the invasion first started. And 2015, they started massive reforms of the military, which have, as we have seen, we are seeing the effects of those. The reason Ukrainian military is so successful is because of those reforms. So that included a total restructuring of the Ukrainian military to move it away from the Soviet organizational hierarchy, as well as trainings by the US and Canada in particular to modernize the technology, modernize how Ukrainian soldiers were treating warfare. That has succeeded. So Ukraine has been kind of, I think, more on the path toward NATO standards than perhaps we thought they were. And certainly they've shown now that, they're certainly capable of fighting what was supposed to be the world's second largest military. To some extent, I think the request is symbolic. Zielinski has been saying for some time, why are we not part of NATO? We're fighting the war protecting NATO. How come we're not in NATO? And I think this, I would honestly say that that's one reason. To some extent, it's some kind of commentary on the failures of the Budapest Memorandum, that the only legitimate security is a treaty, is a signed document that says, here are your obligations, because the Budapest Memorandum did not get Ukraine anywhere. And finally, I do think it's a little bit of a commentary on what's the security architecture of the future. If Ukraine is not accepted into NATO, it's because NATO doesn't want to fight the war in Ukraine. So what's the point of having a security organization like NATO if you're not going to intervene in a context like this? I understand the point and totally, support the Zielinski administration doing this application, but at the same time, I think it really opens more questions, or we should be asking more questions about it based on, what the response needs to be.
Yeah. So kind of a follow-up to that, given, the complicated role of NATO and the EU and the West more generally in this conflict, how, and if you have any sense, how are Ukrainians perceiving Europe and the West support at this point? Are they viewing it as like there's enough material coming in to support Ukraine? What is the views on the ground?
Yeah, it's a kind of combination, I think, because there has been a lot of support, and all the support that has, especially the military support that Ukraine has received so far, goes very appreciated. Of course, we also don't know the extent of all the support, right? We're not going to always see evidence of it because troops aren't going to put their positions at risk. They're not going to show everything that they have, right? But the biggest problem is really that Ukrainians have been asking for air defense systems from February and have not gotten really much of substance. And that is what I think keeps people the most frustrated, is they know that these things exist. They know that countries have these available, and Ukraine is the country that needs them. And yet these are the things that, for whatever reason, Ukraine's allies have decided would be a step too far. And I think that continues to be frustrating, despite the support they've seen, and despite the rather warm reception in most places, especially and really, I mean, some of this is the humanitarian question. Poland especially was extremely welcoming to Ukrainian refugees. They established all sorts of programs to help refugees have an easier time of accessing the resources that were available to them, right? So there has been a lot of aid of different kinds, and there is a lot of appreciation for that aid, but there's still this kind of one big thing that hasn't come through. Although there's also been talk recently of NATO allies in the US kind of creating a new sort of air defense system, possibly with Israel also supporting this. Israel has not been involved at all. They've not given Ukraine pretty much any support, and now they're kind of starting to waver on that, partly because of the proof of Iranian drones, which means Iran has more military technology than we've previously been admitting. So these conversations, I guess, are still unfolding.
Awesome. We have a couple of questions about essentially who are Russia's allies in this conflict. So I'll start with one about Belarus. One of the things that we've seen is movement of Russian troops to the Belarusian border and the pretext of, preventing Ukrainian terrorism. What do you see is the role of Belarus in this conflict?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I honestly, my very honest assessment is that Belarus, whatever happens after Ukraine will eventually win the war and reestablish its sovereignty, Belarus will not exist anymore when this war is over. I don't see how a country that is so essential to this war maintains its sovereignty after something like this. And it's become a staging ground for Russia. That's been really essential. That's been very obvious. The vast majority, as far as I can understand it, of Belarusians who have fought against their regime have had to leave. Many of them were in Ukraine, by the way. Ukraine was rather a receiving point for Belarusian activists, anti-state activists. Again, many of them are also refugees in Europe now. So Belarus's role, I think, is half the state role. Lukashenko's role is supporting Russia, eventually to be consumed by Russia. The anti-state role is support for Ukraine, and that that has been meaningful to Ukrainians as the country that received many of those Belarusians as refugees, to help them live in a safer place and protect them from harm. The fact that many people from Belarus are now on the front lines fighting alongside Ukrainians, that's their hope as well, right? If Ukraine wins, then at least we can still live here. I don't know if they'll get Belarus back ever. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe this will be a total restructuring of the post-Soviet world, and Belarus will also develop a democracy. But it just seems like the state takeover by Russia is so pervasive and strong. I'm not very optimistic.
Mm-hmm. And so if we look beyond the post-Soviet space, Russia has alienated a lot of its previous allies or even partners with this invasion. Given the fact that Russia has had to distance itself or has done so by the invasion, where do you see potential allies for Russia in the war?
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously Iran. That's a pretty unfortunate development because of the military technology that they have. It's also a very interesting example because Iran is so ostracized from much of the world too. The fact that they have continued to develop those technologies, are willing to share them. Iran is already very sanctioned. So what's the next step, right? It's expanding the punishment for Iran, I think, is a big question. Obviously, China is a huge question. I am of the belief that because of how expansive the economic isolation of Russia has been, it's unlikely that China becomes a full-out ally of Russia unless it becomes clear that Russia will win because the economic risk is far too high. China cannot afford to get this economically isolated from the rest of the world. I hope that I am right about this. But I do think that the other problem, we've moved away from talking about food crisis. That was a big topic over the summer. Russia had, of course, prevented grain shipments from coming out of Ukraine, attacked a lot of agricultural infrastructure, making it very difficult to harvest a lot of food that would provide, especially countries in Africa, with necessary food and grain for their industries. Russia and Putin has been trying to find allies in Africa, blaming Ukraine for the food crisis, saying, you know, if this war continues, you'll starve to death, to try to force the hand of African leaders to become allies with Russia. That hasn't actually worked especially well. I don't know if, how many of you followed the UN vote to condemn the Russian so-called annexation and referendums in the occupied territories. But the only countries that voted with Russia were Nicaragua, Iran, and Belarus, as far as I remember. There might have been one more, but it wasn't this, there were more abstentions than votes with Russia, which I was a little optimistic about that. Their attempts to find allies outside of the established allies hasn't actually been that successful.
So we actually do have a question specifically about the UN and the UN's role in the conflict. How much efficacy have we seen out of the UN, and what can we see going forward?
Well, this again, and I didn't mention the UN, but I do think this is part of that question about the world order. Russia is a member of the UN Security Council. Russia inherited that seat in 1991. That seat was not a conversation, right? It was just assumed that because they were the biggest, and because Moscow was the center of the Soviet Union, that they would take that seat. That prevents a lot from being. To me, that's what is preventing the UN from doing anything more effective. Most experts agree that it's a very difficult process to remove Russia from the Security Council, especially with China also being on the Security Council, which is right? China is on, yeah, okay. Mix up all my international organizations, excuse me. You know, China is unlikely to vote to oust Russia, right? They might abstain, but they wouldn't support. So it really, it's hard, you know, a lot of what the UN has done is symbolic, right? The vote to not recognize the referendum, symbolic. What does that mean? What does that translate into? How does that hold Russia accountable in a way where Russia is actually punished or excluded or isolated? Those are my questions, is, okay, what do we do from here? I will say, you know, it has given a nice symbolic stage for Ukrainian leaders to say some pretty effective things that, you know, help people continue to remain on Ukraine's side, that sort of thing. So, and those matter, those absolutely matter in this war too.
Yeah, absolutely. So unsurprisingly, one of the main questions that I'm seeing repeatedly is about the prospects for nuclear war and the use of nuclear force. At this point in time, what do you see as the prospects for Russia using nuclear weapons? If we think that might be a possibility, where might be their targets, and what might change to make these prospects more or less likely?
So my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I am not a military expert at, you know, by any means, and I don't, you know, I don't want to come across as having some kind of authority, but based on what we've seen so far, coming from 2014, right, not just since 2022, is that Russia likes to put themselves in a position of plausible deniability. If Russia nukes any NATO ally, NATO will have to get involved. There's no gray area. That starts the NATO-Russia war that he's pretending already exists. However, if Russia uses a smaller tactical nuclear weapon somewhere in Ukraine, we still end up in the same conundrum. Ukraine is not a part of NATO, right? Ukraine, he's only done, you know, he hasn't done something that's so egregious that would cause allies to get involved. I think that Russia and Putin have to maintain that gray area where it's not an easy decision, because as soon as it becomes an easy decision, then, you know, NATO gets involved, and that's going to be the end of it for him. So unfortunately, I think that the most likely scenario is a tactical, so a smaller nuclear strike on a Ukrainian target. You know, I don't know if it would be something as obvious as Kiev, if it would be something as a, you know, something that could be argued as a military target, right? There's certain ways of spinning as well. I will remind us that there is a very significant fear of a different kind of nuclear disaster, which is at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. It is currently under Russian control. It has lost power several times over the past couple of weeks. If Russia continues to hit Ukrainian energy infrastructure, it will be very difficult to have the energy needed to sustain that, which could result in an absolute nuclear disaster. That will very much affect Europe. I don't think they do anything as obvious as actually, bomb that power plant, because that would again be erasing the gray area, right? That would be too obvious. But the potential for a meltdown or a disaster or an accident is unfortunately a huge threat.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to follow up on that, this is one of the main questions and concerns right now is Russian bombing specifically of energy plants in various ways that Ukraine is going to get power. And you mentioned that this has really serious consequences for the upcoming winter. So where do you see, you gave this talk a couple of weeks ago, you've given this talk now, you've already seen some changes. Where might we see the conflict going on in just the next few months and the next steps?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing that's been pretty impressive is the response to getting people back online, getting people's electricity back up. There's a lot of organizations that are focused on raising money for generators of various kinds, including solar generators, by the way. So one of the most interesting things that has happened over the past 8 months is watching the aid response change over time. So organizations, not only U.S. government and state allies, but non-governmental organizations, activist organizations, changing what the priority is, and generators and focusing on this electricity problem, energy problem in the winter is a huge one. Sending blankets and thermal clothes, right, like to outfit people so that they'll be more able to survive. The Ukrainian government's already preparing people for it as well. I think it's really a question. I mean, again, it's a violation of the Geneva Convention to target this type of infrastructure because it affects civilians. It's not a military target. The only way to protect Ukraine is air defense, unfortunately, and we go back to the conversation of that still the line that it seems like many of Ukraine's allies don't want to cross. So it's hard to say. I mean, does Russia really have the capacity to destroy every single energy system that exists in Ukraine? And if they do that, don't they run out of weapons at some point? And we don't know the answer to that, right? To me, it's designed to test the resolve of people. That's where Putin has miscalculated again and again, because he doesn't understand that people aren't saying, I don't want to fight anymore. This makes them more angry. It makes them more likely to fight back. So I don't know. It's not that much of an unexpected tactic, I guess. It's obviously, I think it provokes a conversation of what allies need to do and how they need to respond. But it is also another way that allies can continue to aid Ukraine without sending, if they don't want to send any more military aid, right? They can send generators, they can send emergency backups, right? There's all of these different ways that, aid can be an effective response, although the best response would be for Ukraine to win the war and not have to deal with this.
Yeah. So you spoke at a couple of different points in the presentation about clear documented cases of war crimes that have occurred. So given the fact that, just the extent of the crime, the variety of perpetrators, and these conditions like the mass graves that we've seen uncovered, what is the likelihood that war criminals will be held account in this conflict, and what mechanisms could be used to do so?
Yeah, this is an important question. So far, we have seen one Russian soldier be tried for war crimes in Ukraine. And obviously, he was convicted. That was very much a symbolic. This was after the Bucha massacre. He shot a civilian. He's like a 21-year-old Russian conscript who is now convicted of war crimes in Ukraine. Again, very symbolic. That guy didn't that guy chose to pull the trigger. So, yes, hold him accountable, but that guy didn't send the order to mass murder civilians. So the question for me is, how do you access the top Russian leaders who are the architects of these atrocities? We know, obviously, we hold Putin accountable. Obviously, he's at, I keep forgetting this guy's name, but the person he recently put in charge of military decisions is someone who's also known for civilian atrocities in Chechnya. So really, the problem, of course, is that you can't extradite war criminals, no matter how much evidence you have to hold them accountable. So I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I think one of the key conversations that I like going down is what's the word I'm looking for? Seizing Russian assets and repurposing them for the rebuilding of Ukraine. That's the best way to get Russia to pay for the crimes that it has committed. So, super yachts and foreign assets and all these sorts of things that are owned by people who are on the sanctions list at this point can be seized by the places that they are sold, and then those funds can go into special funds that will then be used to rebuild Ukraine. As far as actually holding people accountable, I mean, I think it's unlikely unless there's some way that Russians themselves turn on their leaders. And that's not a very likely thing to have happen, because the people who don't support the war, who don't want to get conscripted, they've already left, which means that the people and anti-war activists are very few and far between. Again, many of them have already left. The people who remain in Russia support the war to a large extent. They are not going to overthrow Putin and send him to The Hague, and no one can go in and get him. So I don't know. I really don't know how that happens. I will say that I don't think Ukrainians will be satisfied with only Putin being held accountable. For Ukrainians, they have been saying that for a long time that this isn't just Putin's decisions. Russians also need to be held accountable. Russians have supported him. Russians are carrying out these orders, right? So there's more to it than just war crimes tribunals, right? It goes a lot deeper than that. It's a long-term question and problem, I think.
Yeah. So a couple of follow-ups to that. The first, which is, do you have any sense how genuine support for the war is in Russia?
Yeah, it seems to be fairly genuine. There doesn't really seem to be a lot of dissent. Well, I don't know. If we look at things like Russian Telegram channels, the discourse is very upsetting. It's a lot of very anti-Ukrainian things, we should kill them all, that kind of stuff. There's definitely a certain segment of the Russian population that absolutely supports the war and wants to wipe Ukraine off the map. Obviously, many Russians who supported the war don't support it enough to want to fight in it. That's what we have seen in response to the mobilization that Putin called for a few weeks ago, and this mass exodus of Russians trying to get out of the country because they don't want to fight. Mm-hmm. For Ukrainians, the frustration is, why were you not more mad when we showed you evidence of war crimes and mass graves and civilian torture, right? Like, you care about your own selves, but you don't really care about us. It's not really enough, right? There's not a lot of sympathy among Ukrainians for Russians who don't want to fight in the war. And Ukrainians have also been asking, for all of those of you who have left, where are the anti-war protests? How are you fighting against this war? You're not. You only care about yourselves. You only don't want to die in Ukraine. So in that sense, it seems to me that the sentiment is either support or apathy about the war and concern for one's own well-being, rather than any actionable anti-war sentiment.
Mm-hmm. So given the fact that, there is this support and this apathy that makes up for the large majority of the Russian population, you mentioned, there's probably not any prospects for mass revolution to oust Putin. But this has been one of the major questions we've been asking since the start of the war is, are there any chance that Putin could leave power from some reason or other? What is your take on that?
I hope so. I think it's, I think it's good to be optimistic about that, because if not, the war just continues interminably. I think the most likely is a fracturing among elites in Russia, which, not the most unlikely thing. It appears that some of Putin's biggest allies have not been big fans of this mobilization because it has not gone very well. I mean, there has been a lot of protest in the Far East, for example, in Dagestan. There were pretty big protests, mostly run by women, or organized by women, I should say. I don't want to make it out as if there's no response, and I understand, the risk that people believe that they're taking to fight against the administration. But it's really unfortunately, the way that I think Putin loses power is a total fracturing and crumbling of Russia, which could be quite chaotic and quite bad for the world. Not that I think Russia should continue to exist in the way that it does right now either, right? Like, this is a really big conundrum. Russia can't be allowed to continue like this. They clearly want to rebuild this idea of empire and take over, they don't respect territorial sovereignty. That's not an acceptable way to live in the world. However, the chaos of a nuclear state that is that huge, crumbling into pieces, some of which will be defined by, ethnic divisions that could cause, that have been repressed under the Russian state for some time, that have experienced a lot of violence already, that's not necessarily better either. So I think it's a huge, huge conundrum.
Awesome. And so I think we have time for maybe one last question. And so perhaps a good one to end on is this. So what do you see as the most likely route for ending the war? So given what you clearly showed as Ukrainian government's disinterest and negotiating with Russia at this point, or at least going in the direction that Russia would like, what do you see as the potential outcome for the war?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I honestly, I think that it's very important to believe in the best case scenario. The best case scenario is allies give Ukraine air defense systems. This protects civilian targets. This allows the Ukrainian military to retake the occupied territories, including Crimea. Ukraine's territorial sovereignty is restored completely. And then we talk about justice for the architects of the war in Russia. I cannot stress enough that is the only acceptable solution in Ukraine. And until it is not the only acceptable solution in Ukraine, this war will continue. So really the best thing that needs to happen is Ukraine's allies need to continue to help it, because Ukrainians will keep fighting this war. They're, no matter what, people will keep fighting. Someone I know, the first day that the war started, he joined the territorial defense. He's from Crimea, and he said, this war ends when we take Crimea back. And that was 8 months ago. He's still fighting. People are not going to accept any other alternative. And if we go down the route of an alternative, I think we end up in a very bad position, because if Russia is allowed to end the war by taking over territories illegally, that gives other countries a precedent in which it is acceptable to take over sovereign countries. And that, I think, overthrows the world order that we have more than anything. That's been how the world has been organized since World War II. So it changes everything if Russia is allowed to get away with it. And I absolutely believe that if Ukraine is forced to negotiate, if Russia is allowed to stay in these territories at all, they will do nothing but try again and again and again and again, because that's what they've shown that they'll do already. They don't want part of Ukraine. They want to wipe Ukraine off the map. That's the bottom line. So, there's really no other option than Ukraine winning the war. How long that takes, I don't know. It could be faster, but it could also, devolve into something worse. I'm a little disappointed that 8 months on, I'm still not sure. I've been thinking through the same options this whole time, and it's still unclear. I think that that lack of clarity benefits Russia more than anything. So more support for Ukraine and Ukraine's outright victory is really the best solution, and it's the only one.
Yeah. Well, on that depressing note, hopefully maybe we could have you out in a couple of months and we can reevaluate some of these questions and look back on, where we were a year from February 2020 and look back on it that way. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, Dr. Channell-Justice. Thank you to our audience for your great questions. We will actually be holding one more event this semester on this topic. Dr. Yuval Weber will be coming out or speaking on Zoom, as it were, on November 8th, looking more in detail about Russia's relationship with NATO in light of the war on Ukraine. So stay tuned for that. We should have a flyer going around in just a couple of weeks. And so thank you again for coming out today. And thank you so much for Dr. Channell-Justice.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all the questions, everyone.
Fantastic. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks. You too.